Hey guys, I am coming at you for another video on the Human Rights and Democracy Act. The Human Rights and Democracy Act, in case you don't know, is a bill written by American politicians and is designed to make them into a kind of enforcement body between China and Hong Kong, where America becomes essentially the legislator, jury, judge, and executioner when it comes to evaluating the quality of the relationship between China and Hong Kong. America will regularly audit Hong Kong to make sure it lives up to their standards. Back in September, I put together a thread on this topic, but with this bill having recently passed through the Senate, I thought I'd turn that into a video. So this topic will be posted over 2 videos, and in this one, what I want to do is break down the issues surrounding the bill itself. Then what I want to do in the next video is actually share some clips from one of the original Senate hearings on this bill, where you had a few people of highly questionable ethics, and you can see more on that on my NYU panel video. But these people were claiming to speak on behalf of Hong Kong while also acting as cheerleaders for this new piece of American legislation on Hong Kong. To lighten the mood a bit before diving into this heavy topic, let's start with a bit of comedy.
By the way, it's interesting, China is always going. I think China needs to stop interfering in the internal affairs of the United States, because our treatment of Hong Kong is an internal matter.
Just characterizing it that way might not go over so well in China. Senator?
Well, yeah, there's probably a lot that I do that doesn't go over well in China.
I just love that interview. Even the interviewer was kind of looking at him trying to figure out, is this Marco dude for real? They're not actually giving you one concrete thing that China has done violating the joint Sino-British declaration. You've got some other senators honing in on this point, talking about universal suffrage, the right to vote for their leader. But just as a quick side note, technically that point, universal suffrage, is not covered in the joint Sino declaration. It's in their basic law. And there are clauses in place that talks about the conditions that need to be there in order to grant this. This is perhaps a moot point, but when you've got American politicians talking about sanctioning Hong Kong, you'd hope they could at least get their facts right. But this is a China-Hong Kong affair and a China-Hong Kong issue. If you want to bring the British into it, since they're talking about the joint Sino-British declaration, and if a British politician were saying the same thing, it would still be stupid, but at least it would be a little bit less ironic. A few other US senators perhaps appreciates the irony behind this, and they say, well, it was registered with the UN. The same UN that the US has multiple proposals to withdraw from participating in, and have already withdrawn from the United Nations educational, scientific, cultural organizations, and even the Human Rights Council. That's perhaps only one interesting additional ironic point, but the main thing we need to hone in on here is that the US is not actually saying what China has violated in regards to that agreement, much like how they're handling the Huawei case. This is most certainly not a trade issue. It's most certainly not a US internal issue either. So let's get to the point anyways. Lawson Group in Hong Kong had a really great breakdown on the Human Rights and Democracy Act. So I want to start with a quote that they published from Hong Kong labor activist Ao Lung Yu, I believe his name was, who said, on the point of courting a foreign power, the tables may turn quickly on Hong Kong. These are really wise words considering the precedent America has already set for what happens when a country or peoples have outlived their usefulness to America. This quote becomes particularly relevant when you consider that this Human Rights and Democracy Act will collect information not only on Hong Kong politicians, but ordinary Hong Kongers who are seeking entry to the US and looking for exceptions on the crimes they committed in relation to these protests. Not only will they collect this information, but the bill says they will share it with like-minded countries. You know what other bill says something strikingly similar? America's Patriot Act, which allows them to share information between partners. Well, it seems like like-minded and partners are pretty flexible phrases. Let's see how this played out with the Patriot Act. America had used information it collected in relation to the Patriot Act to let their good old Saudi Arabia buddies know that a 17-year-old boy had participated in a pro-democracy rally. The Saudi student who was on his way to Michigan University got stopped at his airport and was subsequently beheaded. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to feel a little bit queasy even thinking about being on an American list open to their so-called like-minded countries. And ask yourself, what happens when all of America's trade issues with China are all worked out and it also becomes a like-minded country? Well, if you're really worried that China is as brutal as you're trying to make it out to be, you better start feeling nervous about any future administration changes in the US. I mean, even look at Obama's DACA program, the Deferred Entry of Childhood Arrivals Act. It was designed to create a citizenship path for people who were brought to the United States unlawfully as children. The government created a database of personal information, including fingerprints of nearly 1 million people eligible for this program. As you could probably imagine, or have guessed, that only 5 years later, Trump ended that program. And there is strong concern that the previous database, first intended to help these children, will now be used as a weapon against them. Yeah, classic. If you want to look at the act yourself and look into where it's apparent that these databases are going to be required, take a look at section 4B and 7 of the act. Let's continue. Now I'm going to talk about section 6C1A. This is a pretty inconceivably ironic section. It's a section that deals with extraditions, the very thing that the Hong Kong protests started on. Now, America seeks to become a review body to make sure Hong Kong is handling extraditions properly. This, of course, has nothing to do with extraditions to China. That bill is dead, and Hong Kong does not have an extradition agreement with the mainland. It's a deliberately convoluted section. On the surface, it seems to suggest that they want to make sure Hong Kong isn't extraditing criminals incorrectly. But it's more likely to have implications towards Hong Kong's independence in regards to refusing American extradition requests, particularly because we're talking about something within a framework of an American-designed compliance review system. Also keep in mind that the world kind of celebrated Hong Kong for not sending Edward Snowden back to the US and allowing him to freely leave Hong Kong. I wonder if another incident like this were to happen, how it would influence America's audit results of Hong Kong in the future. The irony is compounded by even beginning to imagine that America should be an authority on extradition compliance at all, when you consider their attempt to grab Kim.com from New Zealand, the ongoing Julian Assange case, and the extradition, the Meng Wanzhou issue, the Huawei daughter, whose case doesn't even seem to meet the basic double criminality requirements set out in the extradition agreements between the US and Canada. If the fact that this isn't really about ensuring Hong Kong's autonomy isn't already apparent enough, take a look at section 5A. This bill requires that Hong Kong follow American foreign policies and sanctions on countries and individuals. How that does anything for Hong Kong's autonomy, I don't know. It does the absolute opposite of giving them autonomy. Even Europe decided not to follow US sanctions, most notably on Iran, and multiple countries have even called out the US on their unconstitutional handling and extent of the sanctions on Cuba. Maybe they've learned their lesson here, and they want to build in some conditions that demand compliance in this regard, making sure that, ironically, Hong Kong is not as free as those other countries who choose on their own and out of step with America. Even from the language within that very section, you can see clearly that this isn't really about Hong Kong. It says directly in that subsection that it's about national security, foreign policy, and the economy of the United States. Before I move on, I actually want to add a really funny note. This section could technically be used to require Hong Kong, a separate administrative region of China, to sanction the Chinese companies that the US does, like Huawei and all of the other unconstitutional bans they've put in place recently. I don't think I need to explain any further why this is pretty funny. So let me wrap this up by explaining what happens when Hong Kong fails to pass America's regularly scheduled audits. The city gets sanctioned. Yes. These protesters are cheering on an American act which could result in sanctioning their own city, cutting them off from the outside world and having to rely even more heavily on China. I'll let that sink in for you on your own, and when you've fully appreciated the gravity of that, you can begin to better appreciate, or at least open your mind enough to see exactly how self-destructive this movement in Hong Kong really is. The US is not creating opportunities for Hong Kong with this act, and when the fecal matter hits the fan, it's going to be only the Hong Kong people left holding the bag. And there are enough examples of Americans leaving others holding the bag across the globe. But for one even closer and perhaps more recent example, take a look at the support, or lack thereof, that South Korea got after the fallout to them and their businesses after the whole THAAD missile incident. The Americans were nowhere to be found, and guess where they'll be by the time you realize and say, oh crap, maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. I'll leave it at this for now, and over the next couple of days I'll try to post that breakdown I mentioned at the beginning of the video of the original hearing, where you had a kind of traveling circus of so-called Hong Kong activists cheering on this bill. So that's it for me, and I will see you guys next time.